Patagonia is undoubtedly one of the most prominent brands in outdoor adventures today. But this company is certainly one of a kind for many reasons, including the fact that the man who created it was living on only 50 cents per day and eating out of dumpsters when he started the brand. Now a billion-dollar company, let's find out how Patagonia started and how it became the leading brand for adventure gear all around the world. Born on November 9, 1938 in rural Maine, Yvon Chouinard was a regular American child in those days in many regards. But when Yvon was only 8 years old, the family moved to California. Because he was born in a French-Canadian community right over the U.S. border, Yvon exclusively spoke French growing up with his family, and his limited grasp of the English language made life in California challenging for young Yvon. He had few friends and was bullied for his French accent. It was so bad that he actually dropped out of school and ran away from home. Upon his return, he enrolled in a different school, but it wasn't any better than the first. In addition to struggling to make friends among his peers, Yvon also produced poor grades in school because of his lack of English and the fact that he simply hated being there. But because of his inability to make friends, Yvon spent most of his free time outside by himself, biking, fishing, and hunting. And this time in the great outdoors would be a catalyst for the company he would start in his adult life. By 1953, Yvon was 14 years old and was still considered quite a troublemaker. But luckily, he finally made a few friends, not in school, but at a local falconry club where he learned to train falcons. One of the other members of the club was named Don Prentice, who was an amateur rappeller, and he would scale down large rocks to look for falcons. Yvon and Don started rappelling together, and Yvon fell completely head over heels for the sport. The boys used to travel around California, rappelling down rocks. And while they were certainly passionate about what they were doing, they didn't have any professional gear or training. They would rappel in sneakers or barefoot, as they didn't know any different. But one day, they saw a man climbing the rocks they were rappelling down, and they asked him to show them how he was doing it. Just 2 years later, when Yvon was 16 years old, he started climbing in earnest. He would travel to popular climbing locations such as Stony Point in Los Angeles, California, and Taquitos Rock, and would ask to join various groups in their climbs. In these early years on the rocks, he met 3 men that would change his life forever: T.M. Herbert, Royal Robbins, and Tom Frost. They were members of the Sierra Climbing Club, and they taught him everything he didn't know about climbing, including how to use pittons. Yvon graduated from high school in between climbs, and although he did attend college, he dropped out after only 2 years. Of course, Yvon needed a job after leaving college, and he initially got a job as a private detective with his brother, although it was clear to Yvon that this job was not his calling. While he worked, he continued to climb, and he thought of how he could improve the climbing gear of the time. There weren't many climbers in the USA in the late 1950s and early 1960s, and there was nowhere in the country that was making climbing gear. Everything that they used had been imported from Europe and was considered fairly poor quality. Most European climbers only used their pittons once and then left them behind, in or below the rocks. And young Yvon had 2 thoughts about this protocol. One was that if the pittons were of a higher quality, they could be used more than once, saving climbers a lot of money. And the other was that Yvon thought that climbers shouldn't be leaving anything behind in nature, and therefore should have the incentive to take their pittons with them. So when he was only 19 years old, Yvon went to a junkyard and bought a used coal-fire forge, an anvil, and tongs, and taught himself how to blacksmith. His first creations were the pittons he had only recently learned about. He wanted to create pittons that would last and that could and should be removed and taken with a climber after their climb. Yvon used the pittons he made himself with the Sierra Climbing Club and was constantly finding ways to improve his creations. Other climbers noticed how much stronger Yvon's pittons were and began asking for their own. So Yvon got to work with his junkyard tools and began making pittons for the climbing community of California. His pittons were made from chrome molybdenum steel, and he could make about 2 in an hour. While he did have a small shop in the back of his parents' house, because of his adventurous spirit, he was always on the move. So he figured out a way to take his tools with him when he traveled, and was able to take and sell his pittons all over the West Coast. He only charged $1.50 per pitton, but that was 10 times what the European pittons cost. Surprisingly, most climbers were willing to pay the high price tag because what yvon made was seriously better than anything else on the market. Because it cost so much to actually make the pittons, yvon wasn't really making any money from this business venture. He was completely broke and has since told the world that he was living on only 50 cents a day. yvon spent little money on food, including oatmeal and damaged cans of tuna. In fact, he mostly ate animals he hunted in the wild, such as porcupines and squirrels, and he learned how to dumpster dive to find thrown away food. Although yvon wasn't in it for the money, he realized that if he wanted to live off making climbing gear, he would have to change his tactics. So he took on two business partners, Tom and Doreen Frost, in 1965, and they called their company Chouinard Equipment. The three worked hard to keep up with demand. Instead of just making pittons, they also started experimenting with the other tools needed for climbing, attempting to make them stronger, lighter, and generally better than the options they got from Europe. Quality was their main objective, and a close second was environmental protection. They wanted to keep the climber and the rocks safe with their gear. Because pittons make cracks in the rocks, the team decided to switch gears and start producing aluminum chocks. This switch was considered a huge risk as many climbers didn't use, trust, or even know about chocks. However, yvon and the Frosts ensured that every chock they made was as safe as any pitton, and they showed how the new tool was completely reliable by climbing the famous El Capitan with only chocks. By 1972, the company released its first pamphlet that explained exactly what they were trying to do: improve the sport of climbing while taking care of the earth that provided them with such incredible rocks. And that year, they became the largest supplier of climbing gear in the country. But within just a few years, everything would change for yvon and Chouinard Equipment. Something happened in the 1970s when yvon traveled to Europe that would change his life and the company he had created forever. He bought a rugby shirt. The shirt that he saw on the shelves in Scotland had a collar and was made from thick, durable material. yvon thought that it would be great to climb in, as the strong collar would protect his neck from the gear rubbing against it. When he returned to the USA, other climbers were envious of his rugby shirt and asked yvon how they could get their own. It's important to note that the rugby shirt was blue, yellow, and red, and certainly caught climbers' attention as usually they climbed in white dress shirts and khaki cutoffs. So while they envied the material, not everyone loved the design, but yvon decided that because there seemed to be interest within the industry, he would order several of the same colorful shirts from Scotland so he could sell them to his fellow climbers. And then yvon had another idea. Instead of just selling the shirts to climbers, he could also market to hikers, skiers, and anyone who loved the great outdoors. He thought that to best market the clothing to everyone, not just climbers, he should create another company that was made for the masses. He called it Patagonia. But Patagonia had a bit of a rough start. yvon couldn't keep up with the demand for the rugby shirts, so he outsourced production to a company in Hong Kong, which continuously sent low-quality garments that yvon was embarrassed to sell. By this point, Tom and Doreen Frost decided that the company was no longer worth their time and left yvon to deal with the problem himself. He had no money, no options for loans, and was completely bankrupt. But luckily for yvon and the rest of the world, that wasn't the end of Patagonia. In 1976, yvon and his wife got a loan from a friend and were able to get the business back on its feet. While the money was certainly important to the restoration, there was another crucial change. They promoted Christine Tompking as the general manager. Christine worked tirelessly and asked as many experts in the industry and in banking for help to better run the company. Her dedication truly changed Patagonia forever, and they actually started making real money. With Christine in charge of finances, yvon could focus on what he really loved, which was creating innovative and functional outdoor gear. He began designing clothing made from synthetic materials to allow climbers and hikers to wear less clothing but stay equally warm. yvon dedicated his time to creating new materials that could be used to make these impressive garments, and they started making all-new rain gear, fleece, thermal underwear, and waterproof clothing. In 1985, the clothing line that yvon had been developing for years was officially launched, and although his employees were nervous about such a big change in production, the launch was wildly successful. Over the next few years, Chouinard Equipment and Patagonia experienced more downs than they did ups. from lawsuits to complaints about the too brash colors they had been chosen for their clothing. It seemed as though Yvon was in quite a bit of trouble. Chouinard Equipment had to file for bankruptcy, but luckily, because Yvon had kept the two businesses separate, Patagonia stayed afloat. By 1986, Patagonia was recording annual sales of more than $100 million. But when the recession hit only a few years later, the company's sales plummeted. However, during this extremely challenging time is when Yvon realized that he had built something he didn't believe in. His original focus was to create a sustainable brand that would create products that didn't harm planet Earth. So he spent the next decade refocusing his energy on creating clothing and products that were organic, sustainably sourced, and good for the planet. Although it was a financial risk, Yvon cared more about making the right products than increasing his profits. Luckily for Yvon and Patagonia, it turned out that his focus on the environment, as well as taking care of his employees, proved to be a stronger business model than they could have ever expected. People wanted to support this incredible company, and over the next 20 years, Patagonia's sales continued to grow and grow until it was a billion-dollar empire. The company is still alive and well today, and has not budged on its incredible dedication to create products as sustainably as possible. What Yvon created is no doubt one of the most important and successful outdoor adventure businesses on the planet. And to think, he never considered himself a businessman, just a man who loved to climb. Hungry for another fascinating business story? Click on the following video to hear the crazy story about the boy who was banished by his father and invented Jersey Mike's subs.